to the Michael Smerconish program.
Refreshingly independent politics.
Exclusively on Sirius XM's POTUS, channel 124.
Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you.
Now, here's Michael Smerconish.
Last Saturday on CNN, in talking about the case of the organic chemistry professor, I quoted my next guest, so it'll be nice to have her here and let her fully develop her reaction to this story. Stephanie Saul from the New York Times broke it on a national level. Here's the lead of her piece. In the field of organic chemistry, Maitland Jones Jr. has a storied reputation. He taught the subject for decades, first at Princeton, then at NYU, and wrote an influential textbook. He received awards for his teaching as well as recognition as one of NYU's coolest professors. But last spring, as the campus emerged from pandemic restrictions, 82 of his 350 students signed a petition against him. Students said the high-stakes course, notorious for ending many a dream of medical school, was too hard, blaming Dr. Jones for their poor test scores. The professor defended his standards, but just before the start of the fall semester, university deans terminated Dr. Jones' contract. Last Saturday, in the New York Times, half a page of the paper, if not more, under the headline, "A Professor's Firing Reveals a Lot About Elite Colleges." Professor Jessica Calarco, a professor of sociology at Indiana University, had a different take and joins me now. Professor Calarco, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So before you explain your view, let me first ask, were you surprised at what I saw as the overwhelming response being support for the professor and not for the students? Was that your read of the way people reacted to the story last week?
I think there's been a very mixed response, which speaks to the way that this issue highlights the complicated role that higher education plays in society and the tremendous pressures that are both on professors to help educate the next generation of students and on students to try to use those degrees to get whatever leg up they can in a deeply unequal society.
Is there anything new in that struggle or in that conflict, if conflict is the right word? Has something changed in the last few years, or is this a conversation we could have had 30 years ago?
I mean, certainly there have been many students, former students and current students who've reached out to me over this past week who have highlighted the problems with higher education that have existed not just over the past few years, but over the past couple of decades. Really, this kind of weed out mentality is not new. What does seem to be new is that students, some students at least, do seem to feel more entitled to speak up when they see problems in the classroom or problems with the institutions that they are part of.
Isn't there, I was a liberal arts major, government and journalism. Isn't there something to be said for a weed out mentality, maybe not in your field of sociology or mine in government or journalism, but when it comes to the practice of medicine, you really do want to make sure that someone has the core skill set before others place their lives in your hands.
I mean, we also have to consider what we lose as a society when people who could be excellent doctors are being forced to abandon that goal because of one course that they take in undergrad. Research shows, for example, that students' performance in organic chemistry isn't actually a very good predictor of what kind of doctor they'll be. And meanwhile, our existing supply of doctors isn't working very well for many patients. The U.S. has lower life expectancy than most other high-income countries. And we know that some of our most medically vulnerable patients have worse health outcomes when they're treated by physicians whose backgrounds are different from their own. And yet we have this huge shortage of Black and Latino doctors, doctors from low-income communities, and a shortage of women doctors in subfields like surgery. And so we can't just ask, what are the risks to patients if doctors aren't expected to get good grades in an undergraduate-level organic chemistry class? We also have to ask, what are the risks to patients and to society if those requirements are pushing out future doctors who would be the most effective in treating patients, and especially patients in more medically vulnerable groups?
Isn't that more a message for medical schools than it is for undergraduate institutions? I mean, that should be a wake-up call for med schools. Hey, perhaps we should not have a prerequisite of organic chemistry. And if that were the case, then students wouldn't take it, and we wouldn't be talking about Professor Maitland Jones Jr.
Exactly, and that's why I argued in the New York Times piece that the goal here is not, or that the solution here is not to punish professors, because they're doing what the system is telling them to do, in the sense that these requirements, these types of weed out courses are often designed to fulfill requirements that students need to complete in order to go to medical school, because that's what the medical school is expecting. And so really we need to rethink the sorts of gatekeeping that happens all along the way and change the systems, not just punish the individuals who are part of it.
Here's what I highlighted in the piece that you published in the New York Times. You said, imagine, for example, a student whose high school offered no advanced chemistry classes, who is the first in her family to go to college, and who, in addition to her studies, has to work 20 hours a week to pay bills. Imagine also that this student doesn't have a reliable laptop or Wi-Fi at her apartment, so she has to do her work in a computer lab or on her phone. Now compare her to classmates who took multiple AP science classes, who has no financial obligation and who has all the learning tools he needs. They may sit right next to each other in that Orgo class, but their backgrounds place them miles apart. I'm not so sure that I want the former to be the one who's performing my brain surgery.
I mean, I think really we have to think here about do the context that students are facing while they are in undergrad, do they have lasting consequences for students in terms of their ability to perform these kinds of roles? And if that's the case, if you're concerned about those kinds of students being able to perform brain surgery, for example, why not change the system in ways that ensures that those students aren't facing those challenges? Certainly, I think we can take steps to make classes more equitable, but we can also take lots of steps to make sure that students are getting the support that they need to be successful in their classes in the short term.
Right. And I share your objective of wanting to level the playing surface for those two worlds that you've just described in your essay. But in the meantime, if I'm being honest, I want to make sure that the person who is going to tend to my health and well-being is at the top of their game intellectually as proven academically, because I don't know how else I can get that assurance.
Yeah, and I guess that's where I would turn back to the research that shows that these grades in classes like organic chemistry don't seem to really predict who the best doctors are. And we also have so many other hurdles that students have to clear in order to become doctors. They have the MCATs, they have their medical school grades, they have their USMLEs, their licensing exams. And so I think really, in my view, it's about sort of, do we really need that first hurdle that pushes so many students out of the medical profession when we have all of these other checks in place to make sure that the students who are making it through to the end and actually becoming doctors are the ones who are able to do that work.
But Professor Calarco, couldn't the same argument be made about the MCATs? Because I've had many, many conversations here over the years about standardized tests. By the way, I myself am an antagonist of standardized tests, probably because I performed so poorly on them back in the day in my own case. But when you portray those two different scenarios, you know, the student whose high school offers no advanced chemistry classes, first in her family to go to college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that is the student who's not taking advantage of a paid-for prep course, the sort that the kids in my neighborhood are all taking. Like, they all take them to try and come out on top of SATs or later in life, LSATs or MCATs. So your argument, I think, could be advanced to get rid of MCATs and LSATs as well, and GREs.
I mean, I think in the context of inequalities, and especially the kinds of deep inequalities we have in the U.S. today, high-stakes tests can't actually measure merit. They can't accurately measure students' knowledge or aptitude or effort. If some students are coming to that test with their needs met and with limited stress and with more limited access to things like those test prep programs, while other students are with lots of access to those test prep programs, while other students are coming to class hungry or worried about whether they'll be able to pay the rent next week or whether they'll be able to catch the bus after the test to get to their job. I mean, those kinds of unequal stresses are a big part of why students not only perform unequally in classes where there's tests all the time, but also on these bigger high-stakes tests, things like the MCATs, things like the GREs and the SATs. And they're part of why we often treat these kinds of tests as meritocratic, and we use them in ways that then justify and tend to reify the perception that students from more privileged backgrounds are more deserving of these kinds of elite opportunities in society, when in fact, really, they're just measuring students' privilege, at least with the primary bulk of those tests seem to be measuring privilege.
Professor Calarco, how about this? When I did this segment on television on Saturday, I received a communication. I don't know if it was a text or an email or a tweet, but from my torts professor in law school, who is a law professor at Rutgers through this day. Amazing, because the guy doesn't age. And he said to me, the students have changed since your era, and my era was 30 years ago. He said they now look at education as a commodity. And by that, I think he meant they believe, hey, we're paying for it, therefore we're entitled to receive completion, regardless of how we performed. Have you noticed a change like that in students?
I mean, I think really what's changed is that our society has become more deeply unequal, and that today, given the inequalities that we have between not only the rich and the poor, but between the rich and the middle class, students are told from an early age, your only chance at success and stability and economic security is if you find not only just a stable middle class job, but essentially an elite job in an elite profession. And so students are told from these early ages, you have to go get a STEM degree, you have to go get a law degree, you have to go get a med school degree. And that kind of pressure, it comes from the increasing inequality that we've seen over the last 30 years in U.S. society. And it puts tremendous pressure on students to pursue not only elite degrees from elite institutions, but also the elite of the elite opportunities within those schools as well. And so really, I think it's not a function of students becoming more entitled, but of a more unequal society that is increasing the stakes that are attached to the kinds of degrees and the kinds of schools that students might pursue.
Okay, a final question, and thank you for being so gracious with your time. So the original New York Times story that I'm sure obviously you read, you responded to it in the Times, had thousands of comments appended to it. And the most recommended of those comments was a short one that I'm going to read aloud and read to you. Jay Fogarty says, one of the students complained that the grades did not reflect the time and effort they put in. That perspective misses the point. In life, you are graded for results rather than effort. The students better understand that pretty soon. Your thought?
I mean, I think there's one of the problems with the way that courses are sometimes taught in college is that they are graded on a curve, for example, where students' grades are dependent on what other students do in the class. And so if too many students score too highly, with big air quotes around that, then that can push down the grades of other students. And so I think there's some questions around whether the kinds of teaching that are happening in classes, the kinds of assessments that are happening in college classes are really the most equitable or the most effective. There's good research out there showing that there are steps that college professors can take to make their courses more effective, including STEM courses. And I have many colleagues who are doing excellent work in helping their students to actually learn and to have their performance match the effort that they're putting into those kinds of classes. One of the problems, I would argue, is that many people who pursue PhDs to become professors receive zero training in pedagogy. It's often not required, with graduate level PhD programs focusing instead on how to be good researchers and not on how to be good teachers. And so there's also very little incentive for faculty members to continue to stay up on their training on effective pedagogy and how to be more effective in the classroom and more equitable as well as our student composition changes. And so I think that's one of the key problems, is that there are more effective tools out there, and students are now becoming more aware of that because some professors are taking advantage of those opportunities to learn and improve their pedagogy while others aren't. And so when students see those inequalities in the way that teachers are teaching in some classes versus others, they become more frustrated with the classes that they experience where they don't receive that kind of support.
Jessica Calarco is the author of 2 books on social class and inequalities in schooling: Negotiating Opportunities, How the Middle Class Secures Advantages in School, and A Field Guide to Grad School, Uncovering the Hidden Curriculum. Thank you so much for your willingness to discuss your essay and your work and expertise. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be on.